And yes. All right. So I want to first of all commend all of you for taking time off from your pre-Passover preparations to come and nosh a little Torah. But what parasha do you think we're going to study? What's the Torah portion this week?
It's chapter 12, isn't it?
It's chapter 12. All right. So this coming Shabbat, because it is the first day of Pesach, the regular cycle of Torah readings are suspended. And we are going to read from the section that deals with Pesach from the book of Exodus. We, however, because we've studied that in the past, are not going to be looking at that. So I've got something a little bit different that we're going to examine. So I guess actually, hold on a second. We got a gap in our usual lineup, so I'll walk that over to this side.
Did you two plan your shirt? No, no, but there's a familial thing.
It's a family resemblance,
Right.
even in fabrics.
So we're going to talk about
All right, so Chametz.
Kidneyot.
Well, what is Chametz? What's it usually translated as?
Leaven.
All right, so it's usually translated as leaven, or leavened, if you're using it as an adjective,
Right.
something, something, something. What is leaven? And don't you dare say chametz.
Forbidden.
What?
Forbidden.
Well, on Passover it's forbidden,
Right.
but what is it generally? I mean, is this something
I thought
that
it's-
I'll know leaven when I see it?
It's the 5 grains.
So the Torah says there are 5 grains.
No?
Torah does not mention the 5 grains. I mean, not within the context of leaven.
Oh.
The Torah just says, if you look down on underneath the columns,
Right.
right? 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread, matzah. And the first day you shall put away leaven, chametz, out of your house. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. That's the quote from the book of Exodus, where we understand that we are supposed to get rid of chametz and only eat matzah. And that's the extent of the description of what chametz is. Huh. Okay, so look at the list above that and scan through.
Mm-hmm.
Chametz or not chametz?
Oh, this is a list to find out if it is coming?
Yeah, are the things on this list chametz or not?
Some are.
Well, it depends on whether you're Sephardic or Ashkenazi.
It depends on whether you're Sephardic or Ashkenazic. So for the Sephardim, some things are chametz, and for the Ashkenazim, they're not. Or from the Ashkenazic, some things are chametz, and for the Sephardim, they're not.
Correct.
Correct.
No.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No. So you're thinking I'm believing of the phenomenon known as kitniot, right?
Rice.
Rice, beans, in some communities peas, in some communities mustard, MSG, fennel, dextrose, cumin, sodium methylrobate, sorbitan, starch, stabilizers, tofu. That whole list is a list of kitniot.
That's what kidneyot is.
Well, that is the most extensive list of what at least some communities consider to be kitniot. Not every community says that everything on that list is kitniot, but somebody somewhere has said all of those things on the list were kitniot at some point.
Okay.
All right, does that make sense? Right, so not everyone uses this list in its entirety. Some include some don't include other things. Some have been included at different points in history and not at other points of history. But all of them, when they were included as being forbidden, were being forbidden as being kitniot. And kitniot is not chametz. Right?
What is kidneyot exactly?
Well, we haven't even defined chametz, so how do we define kitniot? And that's exactly the problem. Okay, so Malka, you're hitting exactly on the head as per usual, right? Which is, if we have something that is called chametz, and we're going to use the transliteration, the Hebrew, because it's easier than trying to say leavened and unleavened or what, because especially when we get to kitniot, what's the usual English translation for kitniot? Legumes, right? Which rice is a legume?
No.
No, not at all. Mustard is a legume? No. So we're going to avoid that. And we're just going to stick with, trying to remember the transliteration, kitniot. And these two are not the same thing. Although both are forbidden within the Ashkenazic world, often, the kitniot part, they are not the same. And in fact, even the way they are prohibited is different. And we're going to sort of try and uncover this. But I wanted to do this somewhat sequentially because kitniot have not always been a thing. They've obviously always existed, but kitniot on Passover as something that you should be careful with is not ancient. It's not something that is very, very old. So we're going to walk through the discussion of some of these things and see where it first appears. Okay, so I need a reader. Thank you, Kathy. Rav Papa.
Rav Papa permitted the stewards of the house of the Resh Galuta to mash a dish with parched grains.
All right, so we're talking to Resh Galuta. This was the exilarch, the kingish kind of figure, the political leader of the Jewish community in exile in Babylon. And these parched sort of grains, he let them, sure, you want to prepare those on Passover, no problem.
Said Rabbah, is there anyone who permits such a thing in a place where slaves were found?
All right, very cryptic, as the Talmud often is. Slave here is a byword for lazy and not very careful. Therefore, would you let people use parched grains where there's the potential for perhaps being chametz if you were dealing with people who were not as careful as they should be?
What's a parched grain?
Well, yeah. So best guess is it was some kind of seed or kernel type food that was being used. But there was at least the potential for confusion or slippage from it, which would be permitted by standards, to being actual chametz if you were having people who were preparing the food who weren't very educated or careful. And so the tradition said that Rabbah said, you can't do this. But
others say Rabbah himself mashed a dish with parched grains.
Which would seem to imply?
That it's okay, because he would definitely know.
Okay, so that if you do know, it would be okay. And if you don't know, then maybe you should be careful. Now, this is the closest thing we can find to any sort of discussion of prohibiting something that should be permitted because of potential problems. That was a lot of P's. This is the closest thing we can find from the ancient text. This is from the Talmud that talks about maybe we shouldn't eat X, Y, or Z during Pesach because maybe people might make a mistake. But as you can see, embedded within its own text is, yeah, but if you know what you're doing, it's okay. Which is not the way kitniot are treated in the modern world. They're treated as, plutonium.
Right.
Okay. Let's move forward a little bit further in the discussion. This is also still in the Talmud.
Okay. They brought him unleavened bread, lettuce, and charoset, and 2 dishes.
All right, so that's taken from the Mishnah discussion of how the Seder works, and it's talking about you bring out the matzah and you bring out the lettuce, the maror, the maror.
Oh.
Remember, maror as horseradish is a whole nother issue.
Right.
That was never meant to be. And then charoset. By the way, good endive lettuce nowadays, give it a good thorough wash, check it as always. That's about as close as you can get to a nice bitter flavor for your maror.
Oh, but it doesn't clean out your sinuses.
You can have a spoonful of horseradish with your dinner if you like, but fulfilling the mitzvah of achilat maror, of eating maror, not so good. Okay.
What are the 2 dishes? Said Rav Huna, beet and rice.
All right. Anyone's mind blown? Right? He's saying, what do you serve at the Seder? Because you have to have the formal symbolic foods, but you also have to have a meal at the Seder. So what should you serve along with the formal symbolic food?
Vegetarian.
Beet and rice, exactly. And indeed, there are some people who are vegetarians who use beets on their Seder plate in place of the bone, precisely because of this text. because at least beets have a pedigree of being mentioned within the Seder meal from this place. But rice,
But the rice, that's fine.
you have rice? Which is not only could you eat rice, but according to Rav Huna, that's ideal. You should be having rice with your Seder. All right. Anyone here having rice on their menu Friday or Saturday night?
I might now.
You might. We're going to come back to the what about now, but yes, that seems rather shocking because most communities, certainly the Ashkenazic and even many Sephardim, are reluctant, maybe or maybe not, to have rice, depending upon the tradition of their local community. But according to the Talmud, rice was not just permissible; it was even recommended. Why am I pointing at you, Marian? Kathy was reading.
Rabbah would go looking for beet and rice since that is what Rav Huna had ruled.
So Rabbah, far from taking this as being a menu suggestion, took it as being a menu goal, that you should really try to have beets and rice for Pesach.
Said Rav Ashi, from what Rav Huna has said, you may draw the conclusion that people don't have to pay attention to what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri has said, for it has been taught on Tanayat authority. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, rice falls into the category of grain. On Passover, people are liable for preserving leaven made of rice to the penalty of extirpation.
Correct, meaning cut off.
Right. And someone may fulfill his obligation to eat unleavened bread on Passover by eating unleavened bread made of rice.
All right, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was a minority of one who had an opinion. And his opinion was rice counts for Passover. And
permitted.
no. Well, yes and no. So,
In typical.
well, no, because we got to understand what does it mean for something to be chametz-able, for something to become chametz, right? So oftentimes, and Kathy mentioned at the beginning, we limit this to our 5 grains, right? Which we're going to talk about in just a second, but wheat and rye, barley, oats,
Spelt.
and everyone's favorite,
Yeah.
spelt, right? And I did not misspelt that.
No.
And these are things that can become chametz. That is to say, if they are left long enough after having been mixed with water, they will leaven to a point where they now are considered chametz and therefore are prohibited. But if they are not left long enough and they are cooked properly, they become matzah. They become matzah. And in fact, you can only have matzah for the mitzvah from one of these 5, right? So if you were to take rice, according to all the other rabbis in the Talmud and the Mishnah, and you were to make it very, very quickly into a rice cake, well, we call it rice cake now, but they would call it like a rice bread, a sheet of rice bread. You could not, according to every other rabbi, eat that at the Seder and fulfill your mitzvah of having done achilat matzah.
Because it's not one of those 5.
Because it's not one of these 5, which means it can't become chametz, which means you could just leave it around and make whatever you wanted out of it. And we're going to talk about that as codified in more detail. But I want to make sure we understand that to become chametz is the opposite of whether something can become matzah. If it can't become chametz, it can't become matzah. And if it can become matzah, it can become chametz. Right? And if it can't be matzah, then it can't be chametz. And so, for example, just to begin to tease out the distinction between chametz and kitniot, you have a nice load of beans. Can you have bean flour matzah for the Seder and fulfill the mitzvah? Nope. So that means that beans.
So like you couldn't use almond flour.
You couldn't use almond flour. You can make almond flour bread.
Sure.
Or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But you can't eat it for the mitzvah. It can't become chametz. Right? If it won't qualify for the mitzvah when prepared properly, then it won't become chametz when prepared improperly. They are mere images of each other. If it can't be this, it can't be that. Which is why you don't get bean matzah on your Seder plate, and why also beans are not considered chametz, but are considered kitniot. And there are going to be some differences in how we treat them then. All right, don't worry. I know it gets confusing here. Let's see if we can get Rambam, the great codifier, to clarify it for us. He always says things so clearly.
The prohibition against chametz applies only to the 5 species of grain. They include 2 species of wheat and rye, and 3 species of barley, oats, and spelt.
All right, more about botany than you probably planned to get today.
However, kitniot, for example, rice, millet, beans, lentils, and the like, do not become leavened.
Right? They are not chametz.
Even if one kneads rice flour or the like with boiling water and covers it with fabric until it rises like dough that has become leavened, it is permitted to be eaten. This is not leavening, but rather the decay.
Right. So scientifically, it's an interesting question of what's happening with the flour, the rice flour, when it becomes a poofy cake-like object. But let's make sure we understand just what he's saying here straight up. If you have rice in the days of Rambam, and you grind it into flour, and you mix that with water, and you leave it under a towel in a warm place like you would when you were baking regular wheat bread, and it gets all nice and risy and whatever rice flour does when you're baking it into a loaf, is it kosher for Passover? Is it kosher for Passover?
No, not for...
In Rambam's day?
To eat it when it's risen?
Yes.
Sure.
Absolutely. You can have the poofiest rice loaf you want, according to Rambam, on Passover, because it's not chametz.
But it's not matzah.
No, you definitely can't use it for the mitzvah at the Seder. Absolutely not. You can't use it for the mitzvah, but you can absolutely use it for your lunch, just not for the Seder.
It's like I'm not a good bread person. Bread, only Mary does that. But will water and flour rise without yeast?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But it doesn't rise as efficiently as when you add yeast.
So can you add yeast to rice flour?
Absolutely.
On Passover even?
Absolutely.
But you know, I thought yeast was not.
What is chametz?
So you can't add yeast to wheat.
Right. You can't make those rise at all. So when you make matzah, which is made from these 5,
right,
you definitely can't add yeast to any of those, because even a tiny bit of artificial yeast added to it is going to create leavening. That means it's now chametz. But adding yeast to something that isn't these is not making chametz. Right? It's
somehow it makes sense to me, which is scary.
I'm beginning to get it.
Right. So if you, and I don't recommend this, just opened up the packet of yeast and tipped it back for a nice afternoon meal. Yeah, I know. That's not chametz. It's not recommended. Your doctor doesn't recommend it. But think about it this way. The process of leavening in and of itself is fermentation. Right? It's the chemical process where the starches and the sugars within the substance are being broken down and are turning into other molecules, and the gas that happens is what helps it rise. Right? The gas that's released during that process. Mm-hmm. Yeast speeds up that process, but left to its own device, bread will do this. And Rambam is kind of right that it is a decaying process that's taking place. It's just one that we can capture, and it works well. But that's why sourdough tastes sour. And it's also why sourdough was more likely to be the flavor of bread that was in everybody's house back in the day, because you didn't have packets of yeast. So if you wanted to speed up your fermentation process, you would take a piece of dough left from last week's baking and add it to your new flour that you were mixing together in your new dough. And you would keep that little piece pulled off every single time you bake bread, so that you would always have a roiling boil of starting dough to kickstart the fermentation process, to kickstart the leavening. That was also thrown out at Pesach. Most of us don't have our own little bowls of dough that we keep around, but if you do, if you are a sourdough aficionado and make your own, that gets chucked out at Pesach along with the other things that are chametz.
So is that why baking soda and baking powder are not are permitted? I mean, they're on the list of things that that you can use.
So as long as they are, and so it gets a little bit more complicated in the modern world because we have this wonderful processed food system. And the processed food system that we have now often introduces stabilizers and anti-caking agents and all sorts of other things that by themselves might be chametz, which is why we need certification for lots of things, even though they themselves are not. So, to come back to a question that you probably never thought of, can you buy flour on chametz? Can you buy flour on Pesach? Can you go to the supermarket and just buy a big sack of flour?
Sure, if you're going to do it quick.
If you're going to do it quick. So in the ancient world, of course, you would need flour in your house because you'd be baking your bread each day. And by bread, I mean matzah. So you'd have a sack of flour in the house. You don't throw out a bag of flour. You just make sure you use it properly. Nowadays, given the way flour is processed and handled, the opportunity for water to have come into contact with it, the opportunity for other things to have been added to it that have already been processed and therefore leavened, it's a little dicier. And you often will look for things that definitely have not come into contact or are supervised in other ways. So your general all-purpose self-rising flour, you don't go for that during Pesach. But not because it's flour, but because of what may have been mixed with it. If you wanted to go out and get some grains of wheat and grind them yourself on your little pestle and mortar, no problem. No problem. And that's what people would do. You got to eat. and before we had the luxury of prepackaged, pre-certified food, we made our own, and you'd make it daily. Okay.
Why is corn forbidden on Passover?
Who forbids it?
My mother.
And that's
she does because her mother.
Right.
But at some point, someone's mother had never seen corn in her life because
Exactly.
corn is a new world food.
Right.
And at some point, someone brought over to Europe this thing that was long and yellowy or white, or maybe had a few flecks of color in it as well, the maize style. And someone had to say, corn, Passover, yay or nay? Well, corn was introduced to the Jewish communities, and they basically looked at it and said, well, it looks an awful lot like a grain, and therefore we won't eat it during Passover. But can you make matzah from corn?
No.
No. Therefore, it's not chametz. It is kitniot.
But Rabbi, Passover is in the spring.
Mhm.
Corn doesn't mature until the summer,
Correct.
so it wasn't available.
Well, except corn, one of the advantages of corn is that it dries and keeps really, really well. And so, you can harvest your summer crop and store your corn kernels and use them either to make cornmeal or other, or just keep them dry, like, popcorn style, until you needed to grind them into something. So even though it would have been last year's harvest, it still would have been available around Passover once we got corn farms going.
So cornbread
Mm-hmm.
could theoretically be kosher on Pesach.
Using the same principle as Rambam, when he
Yeah.
talks about rice, that if you were to take corn and mix it with water and set it out and let it rise and get all its poofiness and whatever, and all the ingredients you used were definitely pure and not mixed with any stabilizer, caking agents, whatever, yes, technically that would be kosher for Passover. It would certainly not be chametz.
Right.
It would certainly not be chametz.
So you just tell your mother you got this recipe from Rama.
Well, we're going to come back to our mothers because that's going to become very, very important. So let's move on a little bit to the first point where we start hearing about these kitniot.
It is the common custom not to eat kitniot during Pesach because they rise in leaven.
All right, so Rabbi Asher of Lunel, and I apologize for my French, says that he observed this custom in France. That's where we get this. This is the earliest reference that we have to it, where the people in France, at least in this community, don't eat kitniot. And the explanation they give is
Because they rise in leaven.
they rise and ferment. Now, that's not a great explanation because Rambam already pointed out rice rises and ferments, and yet we permit that, or at least Rambam did. So this seems like quite a novel interpretation of the food product. A fermentation is also something that is not inherently forbidden for Pesach. After all, what do we drink 4 cups of? Wine. And most of us prefer the fermented stuff rather than the straight grape juice.
Right.
So the fermentation process in and of itself is not the problem. So it's rather odd, which is why you get sort of the response that you get in a few quotes here.
The sages of France claim that kitniot are forbidden, and they stated this general principle. Anything that swells when cooked is a secondary form of chametz.
All right, so Rabbi Moshe Haleva, he wasn't a big fan of this. When he visited France and saw this custom and went, what? Because again, what's being used as the principle here?
That it's swelling, that it's
Yeah, along with every other food in the world,
right.
right? You cook something, and chances are that it's, in many of the forms of cooking, going to get bigger.
It changes.
It changes. That's what cooking is meant to do. It's to begin the digestive process outside of our stomach so that it can, it's going to change. And it's often going to swell. So that seems odd, which is why we get
This is a foolish practice.
all the way back in the 1300s. All the way back in the 1300s, yes, on April 1st, we find out that there were rabbis who felt that this restriction was foolish, that it was kind of odd. However, despite the objections of many of these rabbis in this time period, by the time we get in the 1500s to the Shulchan Aruch, this is what we see.
These are the things with which one may fulfill his obligation of matzah: wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt, but not rice or types of kitniot, and they also will not become chametz, and it is permitted to cook them.
Okay, so that's the Joseph Caro section of the Shulchan Aruch. Joseph Caro was the Sephardic rabbi who wrote the Shulchan Aruch originally, and then the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Yisraelis, wrote his appendix, his gloss, it's referred to, on what Rabbi Caro had written to add what the Ashkenazim, at least in Poland, were doing. And that's what we get in the brackets.
There are those who prohibit kitniot, and the custom in Ashkenaz is to be strict.
Right, so by the time the 1500s roll around, even though people had been complaining about this foolish custom of not eating kitniot, the Ramah says, we don't do it.
And this is not when they have been changed from their simple form.
All right.
It is not prohibited after the fact if it fell into a dish. Likewise, it is permitted to light oils from them. One may keep kitniot at home. It seems to me that there are no varieties of beans permitted to be eaten on Pesach.
All right, so I forgot my closed brackets.
Yes.
That's the end of his part. So the Ramah says, kitniot, we Ashkenazim, we don't eat them. That's our custom. But what are the differences between how we treat these kitniot and how we would treat chametz?
Well, if it accidentally falls in, keep eating.
You don't freak out, right? So if you've got, you're making something for Pesach and some beans fall into it, you don't have to throw it out. Now, if some actual chametz, a breadcrumb, falls into what you're making for Pesach, do you get to keep it and say, badal bashishim, that it gets nullified in the mixture because it's less than 1/6? Chametz never gets nullified. That's one of the strictures of Pesach that is not there for normal kashrut. Normal kashrut, if something's under 1/60th, you don't worry about it. Chametz, even 1/1 you still are concerned. You don't use it. But if a whole bean falls in, not a problem. I might be thinking, but why would I have beans in my home? They're kitniot. I have to get rid of them, don't I?
But you don't.
What does he say?
You don't have to get rid of them.
You don't have to get rid of them. Unlike chametz, which is said right up at the beginning in our Torah verse, has to be removed from your house, kitniot does not. So if you have a 50-pound sack of pinto beans in your garage, you don't have to get rid of that. If you had a 50-pound sack of bread, that would have to go. But the beans don't, because they're only kitniot. And this custom may be not to eat them, but you are allowed to own them. If they get mixed into something that you're cooking by mistake, it doesn't invalidate the food as being non-Pesach. And you can even benefit from their derivatives, like oil, for lighting your lamp, which, again, for chametz, direct benefit from chametz is always prohibited. Even if you're not eating it, you're not allowed to benefit from it in any way, shape, or form. So kitniot, no problem. So if you wanted to light your lamp with corn oil, I don't even know if corn oil burns, but if you wanted to light your lamp with some form of oil from kitniot that did burn, no problem, says the Rama. And this other phrase that he uses about if they've not been changed from their simple form is where things get very complicated in the modern world. So he was saying that if it's clear that this is kitniot, you shouldn't be eating it. But if it has been changed beyond recognition, for example, into an oil, no problem. So bean oil should be okay for cooking with, even though you wouldn't eat the beans. However, different communities throughout Europe have interpreted that distinction differently. And because manufacturers need to reach the biggest market base possible, they generally just don't do it at all. And we ended up with a much more strict interpretation by conglomerating all of the different practices in order to be one size fits all than was ever originally intended or ever practiced in pre-modern times.
Peanuts and peanut oil.
What about them?
You're not supposed to eat peanuts.
Well, some people do not eat peanuts because they call them kitniot. Originally, the people who didn't eat peanuts because they were kitniot wouldn't eat peanuts in their peanut form, but would cook with peanut oil.
Yes.
In fact, many homes, peanut oil was a staple during Pesach for cooking with. Not mine, because of the allergy. But in contemporary times, it's getting harder and harder to find peanut oil used within homes that are concerned with kitniot. That it's becoming stricter and stricter and stricter. And really the attitude between chametz and kitniot is becoming very, very blurred.
Yes.
Which is why when we started off, when you looked at that list, you thought those things were chametz, even though obviously beans are not used for the mitzvah of matzah and therefore cannot be chametz. Right? Chametz is a very narrow definition. Kitniot is never ending.
It just seems easier not to.
Well, and so that becomes the question. It's just easier not to, right? It's easier not to worry about beans or rice or corn or tofu or whether or not, quinoa, which was the latest introduction to this list, whether it counts as kitniot or not. That's a really good question. But the problem is you end up creating a system where there is less and less and less that you can use. Because the definition of kitniot, which is inherently inexact, has continued to expand because one community picks A, one community picks B, so manufacturer has to accommodate A and B. And when you've got somebody doing A, B, C, D, and E, then the manufacturer has to accommodate A through Z because it's just easier. Because they don't want to have to worry about getting certified by every little different group and their own traditions. Because as Malka said, people are following what their mother told them. And so if their mother told them peas are off the list, then peas are off the list. And if someone else said, well, mustard is also off the list because mustard grows in pods just like peas, then for them, mustard is also off the list, even though the first group who first said peas were off the list, maybe they were fine with mustard. But now that group, 50 years later, sees the other group prohibiting mustard based upon the first group's prohibition of peas and says, oh, they don't eat mustard. We should probably take that off our list too. And it becomes self-perpetuating, reinforcing, and expanding.
And it's rising.
And it's rising.
Sugar?
And it's rising.
My grandfather made it
Sugar?
easy.
Some people, because of the stabilizing elements in the confectionery sugar, won't use the confectioner's sugar. Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
My grandfather made it easy. We could only eat vegetables that grew under the ground or fresh.
Under the ground or fresh. Although there was a time in some communities in Europe when potatoes were considered kitniot. And the potatoes were not eaten during Pesach. There was a famine in Germany And that put an end to that particular restriction because potatoes were a remarkable foodstuff for European communities in that time period. But yeah, that may be a limit that somebody put on. If it swells when I cook it, I won't eat it, although they play fast and loose with what counts as swelling. Or if it grows in a pot, I won't eat it. Or if it's round like a bean, I won't eat it. Or if you can use it to make bread of any type, then I won't eat it. But almost all of these different definitions that I've heard people use of what is a kitniot are broken by their own observance. That is to say, there is something they do eat that by their general rule would not be permitted. But they say, but my mother said that was okay. Or my father said that was okay. Or my Zaidi used to always have this, and therefore it's okay. Which means that the actual practice of kitniot is much less important because of a legal concern, and more important because of the cherished custom of the community or the household. But we're reaching a particular point in our history where that cherished custom, that minhag avotenu, is getting swept away in both directions. And we're going to get to that, but I want to get the rest of our text out.
There is no need to outlaw these cooked products just because they may appear similar to other cooked products, which are actually chametz.
All right, so one opinion all the way up into the 1800s saying that kitniot was not a worthwhile custom to be keeping. And then another one, just for good measure.
Right. One may, for example, use flour made from lentils because it cannot become chametz, and there is no need to worry that people will confuse it with other flour, which is really chametz.
Right, so all the way up into the 1800s, there were rabbinic voices within Europe saying, don't worry about kitniot, worry about chametz. That's the mitzvah. The other is a custom, but it's a custom that's getting out of hand, as you said, ever expanding. And that puts a little bit of a wrinkle into our interpretation of minhag avotenu. Usually we say if a custom has been an accepted custom and practice of the Jewish people, even if it's not halacha, that we shouldn't deviate from it. This is the way we've been doing it for 1,000 years, and it's a stricture or a stringency that we took upon ourselves. It doesn't violate the commandments, but it has been a good part of our celebration or adherence, so we'll continue to do it. No problem. But when there have been voices consistently opposed to it, usually we don't consider those types of customs as being minhag avotenu. So for example, when people were consistently forcing children to get married to whoever they picked, an actual obligatory forced arranged marriage rather than what was described in the Talmud, which was setting up two young people and then letting them have a choice at the last minute, but taking away that choice, we do not preserve that custom, even though it was common in many communities, because that custom was in violation of Jewish law. And because there were many rabbis for centuries who said, this is not the way it's supposed to be done. But people don't always listen to their rabbi. In very, very few rare instances, people don't always listen to the rabbi. So what explanations were used to justify why this would have even begun in the first place? And Mishnah Brura, which is very, very recent, early 20th century, tried to give a summary of the literature of the day. And this is Rabbi Yair Hoffman's shorter version of that main summary.
So kitniot are harvested and processed in the same way that chametz is. The masses would confuse the two and come to permit grains for themselves.
All right, so reason number one is you treat beans the same way you treat wheat, and therefore people will think if beans are okay, wheat is okay. So the first explanation is it will make the uneducated eat something that is actually forbidden. Not who cares about the beans, but they will end up eating wheat that's been risen. This is going back very much in the same mentality as our very first text from the Talmud. If people aren't educated, sometimes some activities will lead them to mistakes.
Kitniot can also be ground and baked, just like chametz, and people might come to permit chametz grain.
Right, so you're baking a loaf. It looks like a loaf, and you feel like it's a loaf, and you're going to end up making loaves out of other things that make loaves, and some of those loaves are going to be chametz, and now you're in trouble.
And the kitniot themselves may have actual chametz mixed in.
And because of this whole processing style and everything, they might actually have bits of wheat and other things put in. There was a very interesting piece that I read talking about the crop rotation cycle that was common in Europe during the time that this prohibition came in, where kidney oat crops were grown over the grain crops in order to replenish the nitrogen and other nutrients in the soil on the off years. And because of the ancient, or not ancient, but Middle Ages harvesting techniques, chances were there were still kernels of wheat and other things lying there. So when you scooped up the next harvest, you might be scooping up chametz grains along with it. That would then go into your beanstalk. That would then, if you were using it on Pesach, be actual chametz. So it's an interesting idea that this was a functional problem for certain communities because of their crop rotation cycle. But rather than just saying, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but the beans I grow on my windowsill, those are okay, they just prohibited the entire category.
I read a book recently. Lisette Lozana, she's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, but she wrote a book. Her family is originally Aleppo, then by way of Egypt, and then to America. But she recounts her grandmother's stories as a child, where they would before Passover they would put a cloth over the table and dump all the rice, and the kids had to sit and sort through the rice grain by grain 7 times in order to make sure that the rice would be okay for Pesach.
Right.
That was the process.
Right. And then, because again, everybody agrees that kidney oat technically are okay. The problem is functionally whether they are okay, or culturally now, are they okay? Because the kidney oat, despite rabbinic protests, despite people calling them stupid, despite being no good functional reason anymore for this distinction, has become a custom that is very strong in many, many households. And the question is it worthwhile to uproot that custom? Or is it even permissible? So as I said before, there is some real difficulty of this custom being swept away in both directions because of where it has now reached. This everybody's is being included and everything is being prohibited. You get a lot of people who are looking at the texts as we do, and who probably have similar reactions to you, which is, so this should be okay. Right? There's no functional reason to prohibit it. The rabbis, in fact, in the Talmud specifically mention eating rice at your Seder table. The fact that beans and corn and rice and all of these things are perfectly acceptable foodstuffs and can't be used to make matzah, mean they can't become chametz. So we should definitely do it. And this appeal to the text short circuits the issue of minhag. But that's not always a good thing. Because minhag, when it works, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. There's a great story, or midrash explanation, parable, I guess is the right word, in Kohelet Rabbah, the midrash on the book of Ecclesiastes, that talks about having a giant barrel full of walnuts. And it says, if you try to move this barrel full of walnuts, it's going to rattle and shake and break itself apart because of the motion of the walnuts, all loose and bouncing around inside. But if you pour in sesame seed, it will fill up all the gaps between the walnuts. And now it's a nice solid barrel and you can schlep it anywhere you need to go. And the parable was, our customs are like the sesame seeds and the commandments are like the walnuts. So the walnuts, the commandments, sometimes they can be a little unclear or difficult or just perhaps stark, but the customs help fill in the gaps, soften it, and create a warmth and a continuity of family understanding that makes everything work better. Think of our melodies for our services. We don't have to sing a service. You can just get up there and read the text. But how much nicer is it when we sing? Think of the particular meals that we might serve at particular times. Rabbi Galinkin is going to talk about that bring back certain memories and emotions. There may not be an obligation to have a particular dish on the table, but I know many families that if you don't have simmus on the Seder table, you might as well not have matzah, because that's what's always been on the table. On the other hand, when the minhag becomes so burdensome and so overwhelmed by stringencies that have nothing to do with the original, the origin, then the line between minhag and halakha becomes meaningless, and halakha becomes lost. And This, again, in the same section of Midrash for Kohelet Rabbah, they talk about having another crate, another barrel, and this one is full of oil. Oil is a good thing, right? And they say, and the man pours in water. Well, what happens when you put water and oil together in the same container? They don't mix, and what happens? They separate. In which way?
The oil floats.
The oil floats. So if you have a limited barrel and you pour in water,
You're gonna lose your oil.
you're going to lose the oil. And the parable again is that the water is the minhag and the oil is the commandment. And sometimes some customs reach a certain volume where it is pushing out the actual mitzvah. It's pushing out the actual understanding of the commandment. The fact that 9 out of 10 Jews can't tell the difference between chametz and kitniot means they don't understand what God asked us to do. And that's a problem, because we are obligated to keep the commandments and to understand the commandments and to be able to tell the difference. When you see somebody throwing out a bag of rice or a bag of beans because they think they're not allowed to have it in their house on Pesach, they are violating the commandment of Bal Tashchit, of not wasting. So the custom has made them violate another commandment. Now they may be focused so much on chametz that they're not even thinking about the other commandments, but that's because there's no room left, because they have made this other so big. So there's nothing wrong with keeping the minhag of kitniot. And if it is part of your practice and part of your own spiritual remembrances of your family and your traditions, please, by all means, don't have rice at your Seder. I'm not recommending having rice. But if you treat rice the same way that you treat bread, that's a mistake. And if the obsession with kitniot means that there's some other part of either the Seder or your Seder preparations or just other commandments that gets shoved aside, then we've gone too far. Then the custom is now leading us to break the halacha. So we need to make sure that we enjoy our Seder, know what's essential, and if you don't have a strong custom, maybe you want to find a little ear of corn for your Seder table, and I'm sure we'll spark some conversation.
Oh boy.
I
I remember not throwing out, you would put it,
Right, you would sell it through the Mechirat Chametz, right?
every can of fruit that I had, because they all had corn oil.
Right, or corn syrup.
Or corn syrup,
Yep.
or something. Everything went.
Right.
And
not only do you not have to get rid of it, but technically the sale of chametz doesn't cover it.
no.
Because when I make the document to sell the chametz on behalf of our congregants, I'm only selling chametz.
Right, you're not selling.
I'm not selling kitniot. and no one's buying kitniot. The market for kitniot, not selling. So if you choose not to eat it because of the corn oil and you don't want to break the custom of your household, that's fine. But having to remove it, having to box it up and putting it in the garage, the extra toil.
Where were you 30 years ago?
But know what you're doing.
I was 13.
Well, and
Just
also,
having my bar mitzvah.
There's lots of stuff that I've been reading and listening to online in terms of people who of Ashkenaz descent who moved to Eretz Yisrael.
Mhm.
Now, what do you do?
Right.
How do you?
And this becomes a very big question of how do our customs continue now that we live in a more diverse and simultaneously more homogenous Jewish world than we did 300 years ago. And when people are moving, when Ashkenazim and Sephardim are intermarrying, or Ashkenazim of different extraction are intermarrying and having different customs, how does that work out? And there was a very good tshuva written by one of the head Orthodox rabbis in Israel for the Ashkenazim, who said, look, if your Sephardic neighbor invites you over during Pesach and they are serving you food, you don't eat the rice or the beans, because we don't, as Ashkenazim, eat that, but everything else is fine. Even though it was cooked in a pot that also cooked beans, beans are just kitniot, and the regular meal is fine. So eat the vegetable, eat the meat, eat whatever else is being served. You can keep the minhag of not having the kitniot in their clear form, but don't worry about what else was in the pot. And he said this is a very important thing for peace within families and peace among neighbors, that as Jews, we should recognize what is essential and what is not. You know, if he offers you a bagel, you say no. But if he offers you a lovely steak that happened to also be served with a side of beans, if kitniot or something you avoid, don't eat the beans, but enjoy the steak. Personally, I'd go for the beans too.
When Ashkenazi, like the Ashkenazi rabbi, and they move back to Israel, do they go to 7 days and not 8?
Yes. Oh, yes. Everybody agrees that if you live in Eretz Israel, that you only observe according to the calendar of Eretz Israel, which doesn't have the extra day, which is both good and bad, because then you don't have 2 seders. And, you know, sometimes having 2 seders is really handy. It's, you know, first night at this person's house and second night at that person's house. It's a good way to keep shalom bayit.
You know, and at least amongst my kids' friends, oftentimes it's first night and last night. They'll do a big thing, get together last night.
Exactly, because they're making up for the fact that they didn't get the 2 nights of Seder.
Our family up in New York does the Seder at the end.
Right. Well, the last 2 days or day or day, if you're in Israel of Passover, is also a chag. It is also a festival day.
Yeah.
It's not a Seder, so you don't have the fancy plate and you don't have the Haggadah and all of that, but you still should have a festive meal. Absolutely.
Right. And then one daughter's boyfriend's family is from Morocco, so they have Maimuna. They have the after Passover,
right?
You know, glut of
of chametz. All right, so hopefully give you a little bit more history, a little bit more background, and also just a general feeling of how do we evaluate and understand our customs. The conservative movement has been very good at looking and examining at the textual traditions, but we also have to be very good at understanding the spirit of minhag, so that as we make changes or don't make changes, that we recognize what is halacha, what is minhag, and how the two should work together as partners, not making life more difficult. And with that, Chag Sameach. And hopefully I'll see all of you during the holiday many times. We will not have class next Wednesday. Next Wednesday as well, we don't have another parasha to work on. So I'm going to take the Wednesday hour off from this so that, well, I can prepare for other things. All right, take care, everyone.
Take it off to take it off, you know?
You know, not so much.